The night pulsed with music, laughter, and the sweet sting of summer heat rising from the pavement. Bourbon Street glowed in a blur of red and gold, and Emily Carter felt it all rush through her like champagne bubbles, alive, fleeting, intoxicating. She was 26, bold but not reckless, with dreams bigger than her Baton Rouge apartment. A weekend in New Orleans was supposed to be her small rebellion before life settled into deadlines and quiet domestic routines. "Come on, Em!" Lydia Morales shouted over the brass band playing across the street. "One more stop, then we head back." Emily laughed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You said that 2 bars ago." They ducked into the Rusty Anchor, a small place half hidden between souvenir shops and the smell of fried shrimp. Inside, ceiling fans spun lazily, pushing the scent of whiskey and old wood through the air. Locals leaned against the bar, and a Zydeco rhythm hummed beneath the chatter. Emily ordered a rum and coke, smiling at the bartender who wore a faded LSU cap. Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavy, drumming on awnings and umbrellas. The city shimmered, drenched in reflections. Emily loved it this way, messy, alive, full of stories waiting to be written. "Do you ever think," she asked Lydia, "that maybe we only get one night that really changes everything?" Lydia rolled her eyes. "You and your dramatic writer brain." "It's just a weekend, not destiny." But somewhere inside, Emily felt a strange tug, a fleeting whisper of something unfinished. As the hours slipped by, the crowd thinned. Lydia checked her watch. "Let's grab a cab." "Go ahead," Emily said, finishing her drink. "I'll be right behind you, just need a minute." That was the last time Lydia saw her. The next morning her phone rang unanswered. The hotel bed was untouched. Emily's purse was found in the alley beside the Rusty Anchor, her wallet inside, but her pager missing. In the days that followed, New Orleans hummed as always, the city's heartbeat indifferent to another lost voice. Police reports mentioned a possible voluntary disappearance. News outlets moved on. Only Lydia stayed behind, plastering flyers across lampposts, pleading for someone to remember. And someone did. A street vendor recalled seeing a young woman matching Emily's description near the corner of Iberville and Dauphine, arguing with a man in a dark jacket. But when Lydia pressed for details, the vendor's eyes darted away. "You don't want to stir that up, sweetheart." "Let it be." But Lydia couldn't. Not when every night she still heard Emily's laughter echoing between the trumpet notes of Bourbon Street. 2 decades later, the laughter would come back, not in sound, but in truth clawing its way out of silence. If you want to follow every turn of this haunting true story, and others like it, subscribe now, because what's buried doesn't always stay hidden. Sunlight slipped through the blinds of the small hotel room, falling across an untouched bed. Lydia Morales stirred, stretching lazily before glancing toward Emily's side. The sheets were still perfectly smooth. A chill crept up her spine. She checked the bathroom, empty. Emily's bag sat on the chair, her phone charger still plugged in. Lydia frowned. "Em," she called, stepping into the hallway. No answer. At first she told herself Emily might have gone for coffee, but by noon, when checkout time neared and her calls went straight to voicemail, that calm dissolved into panic. She ran to the front desk. "Have you seen my friend, Emily Carter? She never came back last night." The clerk shook his head slowly. "Sorry, ma'am." "You might want to call the police." The New Orleans Police Department station buzzed with noise, phones ringing, officers walking past, papers shuffling. When Lydia tried to explain, the young officer on duty, Officer Braxton, barely looked up from his desk. "She's an adult, right? Probably slept somewhere else. Happens all the time here." Lydia's voice cracked. "You don't understand. She wouldn't just vanish. She's careful. She doesn't drink much. She—" "Mom," Braxton interrupted, "we'll file a report, but unless there's evidence of a crime, there's not much we can do." Lydia stared at him, disbelief burning through her fear. "Evidence she's missing," he sighed, jotting something down. "Give it a day or 2. She'll turn up." Outside, the city looked unchanged. The same laughter, the same smell of gumbo drifting from nearby cafes, as if the world refused to notice her friend was gone. Lydia wandered the quarter, holding Emily's photo out to strangers. Most shrugged. One bartender thought he recognized her from the Rusty Anchor, but couldn't recall anything more. By evening, Lydia's feet ached, and her hope had turned brittle. She ended up sitting by the Mississippi River, watching steamboats glide past. The water moved lazily, indifferent and endless. "Where are you, Em?" she whispered. "Please, just answer." When night fell, she went back to the Rusty Anchor. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting blue light across puddles on the sidewalk. Inside, the same bartender from the night before avoided her eyes. "She was here last night," Lydia said firmly. "You served her. You have cameras, right?" He hesitated. "They weren't working. Old system." "That's convenient," she muttered. "Did anyone see her leave?" He shrugged, wiping the counter. "Don't know. Maybe she left with someone. Happens." Lydia's heart pounded. "If something happened to her and you're lying—" "Lady," he interrupted softly, "you're not the first to ask questions about folks who go missing around here. But I'll tell you this, asking too many only brings you trouble." She left trembling, anger replacing fear. That night in her motel room, she pinned Emily's photo to the wall and made herself a promise. "If no one else is going to find her, I will." And somewhere in the city, hidden behind years of silence, the first clue was already waiting. The days bled together in a haze of confusion, each one spent sifting through empty streets, unanswered calls, and vague leads that offered little more than frustration. Lydia's desperation grew with every passing hour, her body exhausted, her mind restless. She kept returning to the same places, asking the same questions, hoping for a breakthrough that never seemed to come. It was a week later when she finally met Detective Daniel Ross. He was a rookie cop back in 2001, one of the many officers who had been assigned to Emily's case. Now, nearly 2 decades later, Ross had been promoted to a desk job, a quiet life away from the chaos of investigations. But Lydia wasn't about to give up just because the case had gone cold. She found him in a cramped coffee shop near the police station. Ross sat at a corner table, his uniform no longer crisp, the weight of years of unsolved cases pressing on his shoulders. He looked tired but approachable, a man who still believed in justice, despite everything. "Detective Ross?" Lydia asked hesitantly as she approached. He looked up, his expression shifting between recognition and uncertainty. "Lydia Morales, right? You were the one who kept calling back in the day, about Emily." Lydia nodded, her voice catching in her throat. "She was my best friend. I need answers. Why did they stop looking for her?" Ross set his coffee down, his eyes darkening. "They didn't stop exactly. It was just a different time back then. Resources were limited and we had other cases stacking up. It was easier to assume she ran off with someone." Lydia frowned. "But she didn't. She wouldn't just vanish." Ross sighed. "I know. I felt the same way. I wanted to keep pushing, but, well, the higher-ups didn't think it was worth it. There were too many other cases to handle. I had to let it go." A flicker of guilt passed over his face. Lydia leaned forward. "You didn't let it go. You can't. This has been eating at me for years. I know you didn't have much, but something had to be missed." Ross paused, his fingers tapping the mug in front of him. "You're right. There was one thing I never could shake. I remember checking the bar footage, right before Emily disappeared." But it was strange. Lydia's heart raced. What was strange about it? The footage was missing. The camera on that part of the street was apparently broken. No one ever looked into it, though. I thought it was just bad luck. He shook his head. "But I always wondered—" Lydia's pulse quickened. "What? What were you going to say?" Ross hesitated, then leaned in closer. "There were rumors around the bar. People saw things, but no one ever talked. I got the sense that someone didn't want us asking too many questions. Someone big." Lydia's breath caught. "Are you telling me someone covered it up?" Ross didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at her, his eyes full of regret. "All I know is this. You're going to hit walls. People aren't going to talk. But if you're serious about finding Emily, you need to dig deeper. Go back to the bar. Find out who was around that night. Someone has to know something. Lydia sat in silence for a moment, letting his words sink in. She wasn't alone in this anymore. Someone was finally taking her seriously. She stood, feeling a renewed sense of determination in her chest. "Thank you, Detective," she said quietly. "I will." As she walked out of the coffee shop, a storm was brewing in the sky, the air thick with tension. But for the first time in days, Lydia felt like the pieces might finally be coming together. The rusty anchor sat quietly on its corner, the neon sign buzzing weakly in the damp air, casting a flickering orange glow across the wet sidewalk. The city's heart seemed to slow here, away from the chaotic pulse of Bourbon Street, tucked into a pocket of quiet obscurity. It smelled of old wood, stale beer, and something faintly sour, a perfect reflection of the years of silence that had followed Emily's disappearance. Lydia had been back a dozen times since she first spoke to the bartender, but this time was different. This time she wasn't here as a visitor. She wasn't here to drink. She wasn't here to ask for a flyer or a memory of her friend. Today, she was here for answers. Behind the bar was Marty Duval, the owner. He was older now, his face lined with the kind of wrinkles that came from long hours spent squinting into dim lighting and dealing with the relentless grind of small-town bar life. His hair was graying at the temples, but his smile still held the same tired charm. It was the smile of someone who had learned to ignore the past, to focus on the present, and keep moving. Lydia stepped up to the bar and placed her hands flat on the counter, trying to keep her voice steady. "Marty, I need to ask you about that night." "About Emily." His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but it was gone before Lydia could register it fully. He leaned over the counter, a bit too close. "Listen, honey, you've been here a lot. You're starting to make people nervous." Lydia ignored the subtle warning. "You saw her that night, didn't you?" He straightened, wiping a non-existent spot on the counter. "I told you before." "I don't remember her. There were a lot of people. You know how it gets in here." Lydia didn't move, her eyes fixed on his. "You know something, Marty? I'm not leaving until you tell me." His eyes flicked to the door, then to the other patrons scattered around the bar. He leaned in, speaking softly. "It's not that simple, kid. You think people here don't talk? Of course they do. But there's things you don't want to dig up." Lydia felt a chill run through her. "What are you talking about?" Marty's gaze flicked toward the back of the bar, and he lowered his voice even further. "There were rumors about Emily, about some guy she was with. He wasn't from around here, you know, but he had money, big money, real big money." Lydia's heart skipped. "Who was he?" He shook his head, his hand trembling slightly as he wiped the counter again. "I don't know. No one knows. He didn't come back after that night, but people talked. You don't ask too many questions in this town. You'll get answers, but they'll cost you." Lydia clenched her fists. "I don't care about the cost. I just want to know what happened to my friend." Marty stared at her for a moment, then nodded slowly as if he was deciding something. "I'm telling you this because I owe you. But you need to be careful. The people who were involved, they don't forget, and they won't forgive." Lydia's voice hardened. "I don't care. I'm not leaving until I have the truth." Marty finally broke eye contact and reached under the counter. He pulled out a worn envelope and slid it across to Lydia. "This is all I can give you. It's not much, but it's a start." Lydia opened it carefully. Inside were a few faded photographs, some scribbled notes, and a name. Her fingers trembled as she read it aloud. "Ryan Duval." Marty looked away, his jaw tightening. "You didn't get this from me. I'm done here, got it?" Lydia nodded, but as she stood to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just uncovered something much darker than she had anticipated. Ryan Duval. She didn't know who he was yet, but she was certain that the next step in this investigation would take her straight to him. It had been 20 years. 20 years since Emily Carter vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions and a void that gnawed at those who loved her. Lydia had never moved on, not truly. The years had passed in waves, relationships, new jobs, moves to new cities, but Emily's face had always lingered at the edge of her thoughts. Lydia had grown older, her hair streaked with grey now, and the weight of 100 unsaid words hung on her shoulders. She was a school counselor now, trying to help teenagers navigate their own struggles while still trying to heal from the pain of losing her best friend. But there was always that ache, the one that never went away. The news had come to her in the form of a podcast episode, Cold Cases of New Orleans. Lydia had stumbled across it during one of those sleepless nights when the past seemed louder than the present. She'd listened to the entire episode in one sitting, her heart racing with a mix of anger and hope. The case of Emily Carter was back in the public eye, and this time it wasn't just an afterthought. The host, Chris Landon, was a journalist with a knack for storytelling and an obsession with unsolved mysteries. Lydia knew his name from the local news, but hearing his voice on the podcast was different. He spoke about Emily like she wasn't just a forgotten file in an old box. He made her feel real again. The episode sparked something inside Lydia. She had kept every piece of evidence she could find about Emily, police reports, news clippings, flyers. She hadn't thrown anything away. But listening to Chris, something in her clicked. She wasn't the only one who cared anymore. There were people who still believed in finding the truth. Lydia contacted Chris the next day. She had nothing to lose. When Chris returned her call, his voice was warm, but there was a sharpness to it that told her he wasn't just interested in the case, he was invested. "I've been looking into it," he told her. "There's more to this story than anyone knows, and I need your help." Lydia didn't hesitate. "I'm in." That was the beginning of something bigger than she'd expected. Lydia flew to New Orleans 2 weeks later, meeting Chris at a small cafe by the French Quarter. He was younger than she thought, tall, with scruffy brown hair and the kind of intensity that comes from chasing a story that won't let go. "What made you start looking into Emily's case?" Lydia asked, her voice thick with emotion. Chris leaned back in his chair, looking at her thoughtfully. "I've always been fascinated by unsolved mysteries, but with this one it felt personal. The city changed after Katrina. A lot of things got buried. Emily's case was one of them. But there's something off about it, something that doesn't sit right." Lydia nodded, feeling the familiar weight of her grief. She had heard all of this before, people saying things were off, but now it felt different. There was a spark of something more, something that could bring answers. Chris slid a folder across the table to her. "I've been talking to Detective Ross, and I've got some information you might want to see. It's not much, but it's a start." Lydia opened the folder carefully, her hands trembling. Inside were copies of old police reports and photographs, some familiar, others not. The name Marty Duval was written at the top of one of the pages. Her heart skipped. She'd heard that name before. "You're not going to like what's in there," Chris warned, "but I think it's going to take us straight to the heart of what happened to Emily." Lydia's eyes flicked back to Chris. The years of waiting, of wondering, were finally coming to a head. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a surge of hope. The day after Lydia met Chris Landon at the cafe, they set to work. It felt strange, almost surreal, to think that after 20 years of silence, someone, was finally ready to fight for the truth. Lydia, for all her years of pushing forward, had never truly believed she'd see this day. But sitting across from Chris, staring at the documents that could hold the key to Emily's fate, she felt a strange sense of both dread and determination. Chris was already deep into the case, his eyes flicking between files and his laptop screen. He had a kind of energy that Lydia found both invigorating and exhausting. There was no time for hesitation, no time for second-guessing. This wasn't just about finding answers for Emily anymore. This was about uncovering something much darker, a secret buried beneath layers of corruption and fear. "So, Marty Duval," Chris said, looking up from his notes. "What do you know about him?" Lydia hesitated, trying to gather her thoughts. "He's the owner of the Rusty Anchor. I remember hearing his name a lot in connection with the bar, but there was always something off about him." Chris raised an eyebrow. "Off how?" She rubbed her temples, trying to push back the fog of old memories. "He always seemed to know more than he let on, but he never said much. He was polite but distant. People around here don't say much, you know." Small-town silence. Chris nodded thoughtfully. You said he gave you something, an envelope. Did you look through it? Lydia pulled the envelope from her bag, sliding the contents out slowly. I did. There were photos, notes, and that name, Ryan Duval. Marty's nephew, apparently. He didn't go by that name much, but there were whispers. Chris's eyes sharpened. Ryan Duval. The name keeps coming up. Marty doesn't want you to know more about him, but I think that's where we need to focus. It's where all the threads seem to lead. Lydia felt a knot tighten in her stomach. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we find Ryan Duval, Chris said, a grim determination in his voice. He's the key to this. He may not have been directly involved, but he's tied to it. And if we're lucky, he might know something that can finally give us the answers we need. Lydia shook her head, disbelief coloring her voice. Do you really think we can just find him after all this time? He could be anywhere. Chris's gaze never wavered. I know it's a long shot, but there's always a trail. People like him, people with power, don't disappear without a trace. We'll track him down. We have to. Lydia wasn't sure she believed him, but the fire in Chris's eyes was infectious. She could feel the pull of the investigation, the temptation to finally uncover the truth, no matter how dark or dangerous it might be. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings with old contacts, and digging through files. Chris's persistence paid off. A local real estate agent had sold a property under Ryan Duval's name just a year before, in a quiet neighborhood near the edge of town. The sale was unremarkable, almost routine, except for the fact that the address led them straight to a large estate with an iron gate, a mansion obscured by thick trees. Lydia's heart raced as they drove up the long driveway, the mansion looming like a shadow ahead of them. Do you think he's still here? She asked quietly. Chris glanced at her, his face hard. I think he's here, and I think he knows we're coming. The mansion loomed ahead, its high iron gates casting long shadows across the driveway. Lydia's heart raced in her chest as Chris parked the car at the end of the drive. The air was thick with tension, and the silence that surrounded the estate felt unnatural, almost suffocating. This is it, Chris said, turning off the engine. His voice was low, almost to himself, but Lydia heard the edge of anticipation in it. He glanced over at her, his face unreadable. Are you sure you want to do this? Lydia swallowed, her throat dry. I have to. We're this close. If we don't get answers now, I might never get another chance. She stepped out of the car, feeling the chill of the evening air seep through her jacket. As she walked toward the gate, her mind raced with questions. Was Ryan Duval really here? If he was, would he be willing to talk? And what would happen if he wasn't? Chris followed closely behind, his pace steady and sure. The mansion stood tall in the distance, its windows dark, giving no indication that anyone was home. But Lydia had a sinking feeling in her gut that someone was watching them, hidden behind those heavy curtains. They reached the gate, but as Chris reached for the handle, Lydia stopped him with a hand on his arm. Wait, she said, her voice barely a whisper. She strained her ears, trying to catch any hint of movement from inside the house. For a moment, everything seemed still. Then she heard it, a faint sound, a rustle of movement, maybe footsteps inside. Chris's eyes narrowed, and he gave a subtle nod. Let's try the back, he suggested. They circled around the mansion, careful not to make noise. The house was enormous, its stone exterior covered in ivy that seemed to swallow the light. Lydia could hear the pounding of her heart in her ears as they crept toward the back door. When they reached it, Chris gently tested the handle. To their surprise, it turned. The door creaked open, and they slipped inside, their footsteps muffled against the marble floors. The house smelled faintly of dust and something heavier, like the weight of years spent untouched. They moved through the house quietly, avoiding the larger rooms and sticking to the shadows. Lydia's breath caught in her throat when they reached a small office at the back of the house. Chris pushed the door open, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of life. It was a modest space filled with bookshelves that lined the walls and a desk that looked like it hadn't been used in years. But as Lydia stepped closer to the desk, she spotted something that made her pulse quicken, a file barely visible under a pile of old newspapers. Here, Lydia said, pulling the file out carefully. Her fingers trembled as she flipped it open. The first page was a police report, dated from 2001. Her eyes skimmed the words quickly, but one name stood out: Marty Duval. It was followed by a list of allegations, all marked as unsubstantiated, but the words beneath it caught her breath. Witnesses claimed Duval had ties to several local politicians, and there was concern about the nature of his involvement in local crime. Lydia's stomach twisted. She hadn't been expecting this. These were things Marty never spoke about. She glanced up at Chris, her voice a whisper. "This is it. This is what we needed." Chris nodded, his face darkening as he read the papers over her shoulder. This could change everything. The room suddenly felt colder, the weight of what they were uncovering pressing down on them both. Lydia wasn't sure if it was relief or fear she felt, but she knew one thing: this was only the beginning. Lydia's hands shook as she sifted through the papers. The revelations in the file were dizzying. Too many connections, too many people, too many questions. She felt the weight of what they had just uncovered, and it settled deep in her stomach like a stone. This doesn't make sense," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Chris leaned over her shoulder, his eyes scanning the pages with quick, practiced precision. "It makes sense. This is what we've been missing. It's all tied together. Marty Duval, Ryan Duval, and the people they're connected to. They don't want this coming to light." Lydia looked up, the air in the room suddenly thick with tension. "You think they knew about Emily? You think this corruption, it's all connected?" Chris nodded slowly, his eyes narrowed in thought. "I don't think it's a coincidence. Marty's got ties to local politicians and business figures who don't exactly play by the rules. Ryan Duval is tied into that world. If they were involved in Emily's disappearance, it's no surprise no one wanted to talk." Lydia felt like the ground beneath her feet had been pulled out. All this time, she had believed the worst had simply been negligence or incompetence. She hadn't realized the true scope of the web that had kept Emily's disappearance buried, but now it was clear. This was more than just a missing person case. It was a cover-up, a carefully orchestrated effort to keep the truth hidden. "We need to get to Ryan Duval," Lydia said, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. "He's the key. He has to know something." Chris turned to her, his face serious. "I agree, but we have to be careful. People like Ryan, people with that much power, don't just let you dig around without consequences. We might be putting ourselves in danger." Lydia felt the weight of his words, but she knew they couldn't stop now. Emily deserved justice, and Lydia would stop at nothing to get it. She looked at the file again, at the names and connections that seemed to form a path right to Ryan Duval. "There's no turning back now," Lydia said firmly. "We go after Ryan Duval. We find him, and we make him talk." They stood in the quiet room for a moment, the only sound the rustling of the papers in Lydia's hands. The mansion, which had once seemed so cold and imposing, now felt like a prison, a place that held the answers to the questions they had been asking for so long. Chris picked up his phone and quickly made a call, his eyes not leaving Lydia's. "We'll need a plan. We need to know where he is, who's still working with him, and how far this really goes. We're going to need help." Lydia nodded, feeling a rush of determination. She couldn't afford to back down now, not when they were so close. She glanced back at the papers in her hands, the feeling of dread and anticipation settling in her chest. "Let's do this," she said. "Let's find Ryan Duval and end this." As Chris made his call, Lydia's thoughts raced ahead, imagining what would happen when they finally confronted Ryan Duval. Would he be able to keep his cool, or would the truth finally come spilling out, just like everything else they had uncovered? One thing was certain: this investigation was about to take them deeper into darkness than they'd ever anticipated. The quiet hum of the city surrounded Lydia as she sat across from Chris in the small coffee shop, the papers from the mansion spread out between them. The weight of their next steps hung heavily in the air. The pieces were starting to fit together, but there were still so many gaps, too many unanswered questions. The more they uncovered, the deeper the rabbit hole seemed to go. Chris was on his laptop, scanning through old public records and news clippings. Lydia ran a hand through her hair, frustrated by the lack of concrete leads. She had hoped for something more definitive by now, some piece of evidence that would tie everything together in a neat bow. But instead, all she had were whispers, rumors, and documents that didn't make sense. "I can't believe how deep this goes," Lydia muttered, staring at a photo of a young Ryan Duval from the early 2000s. He looked so different then, innocent, almost unrecognizable from the man he was now. Chris glanced up from his screen, his eyes darkened with realization. It's worse than we thought. Marty Duval's ties to local politics, to businesses in the French Quarter. This wasn't just some small-time thing, this is a whole network. Lydia looked at him, a sinking feeling in her chest. What does that mean for Emily? If Ryan's involved in this, if Marty is involved, it's not just about her disappearing anymore. It's about something much bigger. Chris nodded, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Exactly. And that's what we need to dig into. We need to find out who else is involved, who helped cover this up, because Emily's disappearance wasn't just about her. She was the trigger, the one thing that could have unraveled everything. Lydia felt a chill creep over her as she considered Chris's words. She had always thought of Emily as the victim, her best friend, the one who had been taken too soon. But now, she was starting to see that Emily had been something more. She had been a threat to a whole system of corruption. "How do we even start?" Lydia asked, her voice shaking slightly. Chris leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "We follow the money. We find out where it's flowing, who's paying who, and how it all connects. Ryan Duval, Marty Duval. They're at the center of it, but there are others we haven't even touched yet. We need to start looking at the people around them, the ones who might have the power to make things disappear." Lydia nodded, her mind spinning with all the pieces. She had never imagined something like this. She had always thought of New Orleans as the city of jazz, of history and culture. But now it felt like a city of secrets, a city where power ran deep beneath the surface, hiding the truth in the shadows. "Okay," she said, her voice firm now. "We start with Ryan. We find out where he's hiding, and we start digging into his business dealings. I don't care how deep it goes, I'm going to find out what happened to Emily." Chris didn't hesitate. He grabbed his phone and made a quick call, his voice low and steady. As he hung up, he turned to Lydia, a grim expression on his face. "We've got a lead. Ryan Duval's been spotted in town near his old office. It's not much, but it's something." Lydia felt her heart race as she stood up, determination flooding her veins. "Then let's go. We're not letting him get away this time." They left the coffee shop and headed toward the office building where Ryan Duval had once worked. Lydia's thoughts were racing. She was so close now, so close to finding the truth. The air felt thicker as they approached the building, the city buzzing around them, unaware of the storm that was brewing just beneath the surface. This was it. The moment that would either break them or lead them to the answers they had been searching for. The quiet hum of the city seemed to fade away as Lydia and Chris stood outside the office building, staring up at the towering structure. The lead they had followed here felt fragile, barely a whisper, but it was all they had. Ryan Duval was supposed to be inside, or at least someone who could point them in his direction. "This is it," Lydia said, her voice tight. The realization of how close they were felt both exhilarating and terrifying. "We find him now. We finally get some answers." Chris gave her a determined nod. "We just need to be careful. If Ryan knows we're looking for him, he won't make it easy." Lydia swallowed hard, the fear and anticipation mixing in her chest. "I'm ready." The building lobby was sleek and cold, marble floors reflecting the artificial lights above. Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that everything about this place was designed to hide something. Nothing here was meant to be seen, just like the people they were after. They approached the front desk, where a receptionist looked up with a forced smile. "Can I help you?" "We're looking for Ryan Duval. Is he available?" Chris asked, his tone casual but firm. The receptionist's smile faltered for a second before she quickly recovered. "I'm afraid Mr. Duval is no longer working here. He left several months ago." Lydia's heart sank. "Do you know where he went? Do you have a forwarding address or contact?" The receptionist hesitated, glancing between them nervously. "I'm sorry, but I'm not at liberty to share that information." She picked up the phone, signaling the end of the conversation. Lydia's mind raced. They couldn't afford to lose him now, not when they were so close. "There has to be something. A record of where he went, who he's working with, something," she muttered to Chris, frustration boiling over. Chris was already thinking ahead. "Let's head to the building's records office. If Ryan left anything official, it's got to be there." They moved quickly through the maze of halls, the weight of urgency pressing on them. When they reached the records office, they found an elderly woman behind a desk, sorting through a stack of papers. She looked up when they entered, giving them a quick, disinterested glance. "Can I help you?" she asked, barely lifting her eyes from the papers. "We need information about Ryan Duval," Chris said, his voice polite but insistent. "Where did he go after leaving here?" The woman raised an eyebrow, as if she were considering the request carefully. "That's sensitive information. I can't just hand it over to anyone." Lydia stepped forward, a sense of urgency flooding her words. "This is important. We're investigating something that could help solve a crime." The mention of the word crime seemed to have an effect. The woman hesitated, then opened a drawer and pulled out a folder. "I'm not supposed to give you this," she muttered, pushing it across the desk. Lydia's pulse quickened as she reached for the file. She opened it, scanning the contents. There it was, an address, a name, a possible lead. Ryan Duval had been in contact with a high-profile real estate firm, and the address listed was in a secluded part of the city. Lydia's eyes widened. "This is it. This is where he's been hiding." Chris looked at the address and nodded. "Let's go." "We've got one shot at this." The door to the records office shut behind them as they left, a new sense of purpose driving them forward. But as Lydia looked down at the piece of paper in her hand, she felt the weight of everything they had uncovered so far. Ryan Duval wasn't just hiding from them, he was hiding from the truth, and they were getting closer to finding it. The streets of New Orleans were quieter than usual that evening, the usual hum of the city muted by the threat of a storm in the air. The humidity hung heavy, and the sky was a thick, bruised purple. It felt as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Lydia and Chris stood across the street from a nondescript building on the outskirts of town, the address from the file they'd obtained earlier. The real estate office, a tall, outdated structure with dark windows, had been the last known location for Ryan Duval. It was a place that held the answers, they hoped, or at the very least a confrontation with the man who had been elusive for so long. Lydia's heart raced as they watched the entrance, her fingers twitching at her sides. "This is it," she said, the words almost lost in the wind. Chris nodded, his face unreadable. "We go in, we get him, and we get answers. No turning back now." They moved toward the building, their footsteps muffled by the thick air. Every step felt like an eternity. When they reached the door, Lydia felt a cold rush of dread sweep over her. Would Ryan Duval be there? Would he fight back? Or would he finally come clean about everything that had been hidden for years? Chris rang the doorbell, and after a long pause, the door creaked open. A middle-aged man in a suit stood in the doorway, his expression wary. "Can I help you?" he asked, eyeing them both cautiously. "We're looking for Ryan Duval," Chris said, his tone calm but firm. "We need to speak with him." The man's eyes flickered with something, fear perhaps, but he quickly masked it. "He's not here. He's not taking any appointments." Lydia stepped forward, her voice steady. "We know he's here. We need to talk to him now." "It's about Emily Carter." The mention of Emily's name caused the man to stiffen, and for a moment he said nothing. His eyes darted nervously between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I don't know what you're talking about. Ryan is not here." Lydia's patience snapped. "Don't lie to me," she said, her voice rising. "We know Ryan Duval is involved. We know he's been hiding the truth. Tell us where he is or we'll find him ourselves." Chris stepped in, his voice colder now. "You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The man seemed to shrink under their combined intensity. Finally, he stepped aside. "He's upstairs, but I'm telling you, this won't end well." "You don't understand who you're dealing with." Ignoring his warning, they pushed past him. moving quickly toward the stairs. Each step felt like the final approach to a confrontation they had been waiting for years. The tension in the air was palpable, each second stretching longer than the last. They reached the top floor where the hallway stretched before them in silence. At the end of the hall, a door was slightly ajar. From inside, they could hear the faintest sound, footsteps. Ryan Duval was there. Lydia didn't hesitate. She reached for the door, throwing it open. Inside, Ryan Duval stood at the far end of the room, his back to them. The moment he turned and saw them, his face drained of color. "Lydia, Chris," he said, his voice shaky but defiant. "You have no idea what you're doing." Chris stepped forward, his voice firm. "We know exactly what we're doing. It's over, Ryan. You're coming with us." Ryan's eyes flicked to the window, his mind clearly racing. But before he could make a move, two uniformed officers entered the room from behind. They grabbed Ryan's arms and cuffed him before he could protest. As he was led away, Lydia watched, a strange sense of relief and triumph mixing with the weight of everything they had uncovered. The man who had been hiding in the shadows for so long was finally being held accountable. Ryan Duval had been arrested, but the real work, finding out who else was involved, had just begun. The courtroom was packed. The faint sound of whispers filled the air as Lydia sat at the back, her heart pounding. The trial had finally begun. Ryan Duval, now facing charges for Emily Carter's disappearance, sat at the defendant's table, his eyes a mixture of defiance and fear. His once cool demeanor had cracked, and for the first time in years, Lydia felt a glimmer of justice within her reach. The atmosphere in the room was tense, every inch charged with the weight of what was at stake. The air felt thick, heavy with years of unanswered questions. Lydia clutched the edge of her seat, her breath shallow as the opening statements began. The prosecution spoke first, their words measured, calm. They painted a chilling picture of Ryan Duval's involvement in Emily's disappearance, linking him to a network of corruption and crime in New Orleans. They spoke of the cover-up, the manipulation, and the lengths Duval had gone to keep the truth buried. Lydia felt the weight of every word. It was a brutal but necessary reckoning for the man who had destroyed her best friend's life. Then came the defense. Ryan's lawyer was smooth, polished, everything Ryan himself had once been. The lawyer spoke with the practiced ease of someone who had won more than his share of battles. He painted Ryan as a victim of circumstance, a man who had been wronged by others, someone who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Lydia's blood boiled at the lies, but she knew better than to let her emotions overtake her. This was the moment she had been waiting for, and she couldn't afford to lose control. When it was her turn to testify, Lydia stood slowly, her legs shaking with the weight of the moment. She took a deep breath, glancing over at Ryan for the first time since his arrest. His eyes met hers briefly, but there was no apology there. Only the cold, detached gaze of someone who had spent years hiding behind lies. Lydia stepped up to the stand and looked out at the jury. Her voice, when it came, was steady, but filled with the emotion she had carried for years. "My name is Lydia Morales," she began. "I was Emily Carter's best friend. I know the pain of having someone you love disappear without a trace. For 20 years I lived with the guilt, the grief, and the unanswered questions. But I'm here today because I want you to know the truth." Her words felt like a release, a long-awaited confession to a wound that had never healed. She went on, recounting the details of Emily's life, her disappearance, and the investigation that had consumed her. She spoke of the fear that had plagued her when the police failed to act, the desperation that had driven her to search for answers when no one else would. As she spoke, Lydia felt the eyes of the courtroom on her, felt their attention shift from Ryan to the truth she was telling. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for Emily. When she finished, the silence in the room was deafening. The jury, the judge, even the defense seemed to pause, as if finally realizing the depth of what had been hidden for so long. Ryan's lawyer objected, but the judge overruled him. There was no denying what Lydia had said. The truth was finally out. Lydia sat back down, her heart racing. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her, but she also felt something else: relief. The truth was out. And no matter what happened next, she had finally told Emily's story. As the trial continued, the evidence mounted against Ryan Duval. The witnesses, the documents, the testimony, it all pointed to one undeniable truth. Ryan was responsible for the crime that had haunted New Orleans for 2 decades. But for Lydia, the trial wasn't just about a conviction. It was about justice, about finding peace. She had waited so long for this moment. And now, as the closing arguments began, she knew one thing for sure. Emily's story would no longer be buried in the shadows. The gavel struck, a sound that resonated in the quiet courtroom, signaling the end of a long and grueling trial. Lydia felt the weight of it, like the end of an era, but also the beginning of something new. Ryan Duval had been convicted, guilty on all counts. The years of searching, the painful pursuit of justice had culminated in this moment. Lydia sat motionless for a moment, absorbing the words of the judge. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, but it felt distant, like she was hearing it all from underwater. Her body was tense, but the exhaustion she had been carrying for so long was finally starting to lift. The prosecutor approached, offering a quiet nod of approval. "You did it, Lydia. You got the truth out." Lydia nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at her lips. It felt surreal. It wasn't just me. It was all of us. We got Emily's story heard. Chris, who had been sitting next to her through the trial, leaned in. His voice was low but warm. "You didn't give up. And that's why we're here today." She looked at him, grateful for his unwavering support. It had been him who had kept pushing when the case felt like it was slipping through their fingers. His belief in the truth had fueled her, and now it was all paying off. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Lydia stood up, her knees feeling weak beneath her. She glanced over at Ryan Duval, now handcuffed and being escorted out. He avoided her gaze, his head down, a man who had spent years hiding behind a facade of power and influence. But now, it was over. He would face the consequences of his actions, and perhaps for the first time in years he would have to confront the truth. Lydia's thoughts shifted to Emily. The closure wasn't just for her. It was for her best friend, the girl who had been silenced so brutally. Emily's face, her laugh, her dreams, these were the things Lydia held on to. The loss had been immense, but the truth had been even greater. And now, after 2 decades of searching, she had finally found the peace she needed to move forward. Later that evening, Lydia stood at the edge of the Mississippi River, the cool breeze lifting her hair. The river had always been a symbol for Emily, one of endless possibilities, flowing forward without looking back. Lydia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything she had carried now easing. Emily's memory would live on, not as a mystery, but as a story of perseverance, of friendship, of justice. The stars above seemed brighter now, the same stars Emily had once dreamed under. Lydia whispered a quiet goodbye, a promise that she would never forget her. "I did it for you, Em," she said softly. And in that moment the silence around her felt like peace. The story of Emily Carter was no longer a mystery, it was a legacy. Lydia turned and walked away, the weight in her chest lifted, and for the first time in years, she felt free. Months had passed since the trial, but the weight of it all still lingered in the air. Lydia often found herself lost in thought, replaying moments from the past, of Emily's laughter, her smile, the way they had spent endless nights talking about their futures. It seemed so long ago, yet the ache of her absence was still fresh, as though it had never truly gone away. But as the seasons changed and the city of New Orleans slowly began to return to its rhythm, Lydia found herself letting go. Emily's story had been heard. The truth was no longer hidden. Ryan Duval was behind bars, and though it couldn't undo the pain, there was a sense of justice that wrapped around Lydia like a comforting embrace. Lydia had become a voice for those who had no one to speak for them, a voice for Emily. The memorial for Emily, established by the community, had taken shape in the form of a scholarship fund for young women aspiring to become journalists. It was something Emily had always dreamed of, something she would have done. Lydia had made sure it was done in her honor. One afternoon, as Lydia stood at the small ceremony to unveil the scholarship's plaque, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. The crowd gathered around, the energy in the air electric with purpose. Emily's parents were there, tearful but proud, and though their daughter was gone, this gesture felt like a new chapter, a new legacy for her. A soft voice interrupted Lydia's thoughts. "You've done it, Lydia. You've given her a future." It was Chris standing beside her, his eyes filled with the same mix of pride and gratitude. Lydia gave a quiet smile, her eyes fixed on the plaque. "We gave her a future," she corrected him. "Emily's story will live on, and it'll never be forgotten, not by me. Not by anyone." The crowd's applause filled the air as the plaque was revealed, a simple but powerful tribute. It read, "In memory of Emily Carter, a voice that was silenced too soon, but whose truth will never be forgotten." Lydia's heart swelled, a mixture of sorrow and hope intertwining. Emily's legacy was no longer something buried in the past. It was something tangible, something that would outlast them all. The scholarship would inspire generations of young women to pursue their dreams, just as Emily would have. Lydia turned to Chris, her voice steady but full of emotion. This is what she would have wanted." Chris nodded, his expression soft. "It's more than justice. It's a life lived beyond the pain. It's what Emily deserved." As the ceremony ended and people began to disperse, Lydia stood there, staring at the plaque, allowing herself to finally feel peace. There would be no more questions left unanswered, no more endless searching. Emily's memory had been honored and her story had been told. Lydia had found closure, not in an end, but in a new beginning. She had taken the darkest chapter of her life and turned it into something meaningful, something that would touch countless lives. And as the sun began to set over the Mississippi River, Lydia knew one thing for sure: Emily would never be forgotten. Her legacy would live on, and so would Lydia's promise to never let the truth be silenced again. It had been a year since the trial, a year since Ryan Duval was locked away, and yet New Orleans still felt the weight of the case lingering in the air. The truth had been uncovered, but the city still carried the scars of the past, as if everyone knew something dark had once been hidden in its heart. Lydia had found herself living in the aftershock of what they had all uncovered, but it wasn't just the tragedy of Emily's death that weighed on her anymore. It was the impact that Emily's legacy had begun to create. The scholarship had been a success, and more young women from all over the country were starting to apply, inspired by Emily's story. Lydia had spent months speaking at events, honoring Emily's memory by telling the world about the dreams they had shared together. She had turned the grief of losing her best friend into something tangible, something that could create change. On the anniversary of Emily's death, Lydia stood in front of the scholarship's plaque again, the words etched into the stone reflecting the light of the setting sun. In memory of Emily Carter, a voice that was silenced too soon, but whose truth will never be forgotten. She felt Chris beside her, his presence a constant support throughout everything. "She would have loved this," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the plaque. Lydia smiled, the tears she had fought for so long finally welling in her eyes. "I think she does. I think she's proud." Chris placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice warm. "You did something incredible here, Lydia. You gave her the life she always wanted, just in a different way." Lydia nodded, though her throat tightened. "It doesn't feel like enough. It'll never feel like enough. But I have to keep going. I have to make sure that no one forgets her, that what happened to Emily doesn't just fade into the past." "You won't let it," Chris replied, his voice firm. "You've built something here. You've created a future where Emily's voice still lives. People will remember her. I promise." Lydia looked out at the crowd gathering, the quiet hum of their conversations filling the air. It was a peaceful day, the weather warm but not oppressive, and the city seemed to be holding its breath, almost as if giving respect to the moment. She stood there for a long time, her thoughts drifting between the past and the future, between the grief that had defined so many years and the hope that was finally starting to take root. Emily's story, though painful, had left a mark that would last forever. Lydia had made sure of that. She had honored her best friend's memory with the one thing that had been robbed from her: a voice. As the evening drew to a close, Lydia walked away from the memorial, her heart full, but lighter than it had been in years. Emily's legacy wasn't just about the scholarship or the justice that had been served. It was about the impact one life could have, how a single person could change the course of everything, even from beyond the grave. Lydia looked up at the sky, the stars beginning to appear as the sun set over the horizon. She whispered under her breath, "I'll keep telling your story, Em. I'll make sure everyone knows." And for the first time in a long while, Lydia felt like she had finally kept her promise. Emily's story would never be forgotten.